So the title for this one is The Slowly Opening Door, 50 Years of Indian Political Reform. And that's really the perfect way to think about this period. For 50 incredibly important years, the British were slowly, very cautiously, opening the door to political power for Indians. So let's walk through that doorway together and see what happened, one step at a time.
All right, let's kick things off with a pretty huge question. How does a rebellion change an empire? Because, that's exactly where our story starts. This isn't about some quiet, polite negotiation. Nope. It begins with a massive, empire-shaking event that forced the British to completely rethink everything.
You see, the Great Revolt of 1857 was a massive wake-up call for the British. It made them realize, pretty forcefully, that you just can't govern a subcontinent by force alone. It wasn't going to work. So they needed a new strategy. And that strategy was cooperation. Now, this wasn't really born out of a sudden change of heart. It was more about pure necessity. They had to prevent another rebellion. The Crown knew it had to start involving Indians in governing their own country. And that sets the stage for the three big acts we're about to break down.
All right, here we go. This is our first major milestone. Now, let's be clear. This wasn't a revolution in how things were run, but it was a huge moment. It was the very first, very cautious crack in that solid wall of exclusive British rule.
So what did this act actually do? Well, it created the very beginnings of what you and I would call representative institutions. For the absolute first time, the Viceroy was allowed to nominate Indians as non-official members to his legislative council. Think about that. The door was just barely cracked open, maybe just an inch, but it was finally unlocked.
And this wasn't just some abstract policy change on paper. We're talking about real people here. In 1862, the Viceroy, Lord Canning, he actually nominated three very influential Indians, the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinker Rao. This really shows you how personal and symbolic this first step was. These were the first Indians to ever be officially inside the lawmaking process.
So it wasn't just about adding a few Indian members. The 1861 Act actually made some really important structural changes. It kicked off a process of decentralization, it set up new councils in other provinces, and it made the portfolio system official. That's basically assigning one person to be in charge of a specific department, kind of like a modern cabinet minister.
Okay, so you might be wondering, what exactly does decentralization mean in this context? Well, for a long time, Britain's strategy had been to pull all the power into the center. This act started to undo that. It gave the provinces of Bombay and Madras their lawmaking powers back, which was a pretty big deal, and a move that, down the line, would lead to more regional control.
All right, fast forward about 30 years, and we get to the next major act. The door had been cracked open, right? So the big question now is, how much wider did it swing this time?
And the change was pretty significant. Before 1892, the councils couldn't do much. But after this act, they could actually discuss the budget and even ask questions of the executive. The analogy of commenting on the family budget is perfect. You still couldn't decide how the money was spent, but for the first time, you actually had a voice in the conversation.
But check this out. Here's a really fascinating little detail. The Act brought in this limited, indirect system for filling some seats, which was basically, for all intents and purposes, an election. But get this, the British were so nervous about the idea that they refused to use the actual word election anywhere in the Act. No way. Instead, it was called nomination on the recommendation of certain bodies. Talk about a careful, or maybe just a very nervous, choice of words.
Okay, let's jump to our third and final act, the one also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. And this one wasn't just another small step. This was a giant leap forward. But, and this is a huge but, it was a leap that came with some major and seriously controversial consequences. Just look at this number, 60. The size of the Central Legislative Council jumped from only 16 members all the way to 60. That is a huge expansion of the Indian presence right at the very heart of the government.
And it wasn't just about numbers, their powers grew too. Now members could ask follow-up questions, supplementary questions, and even put forward resolutions on the budget. And this is crucial. For the very first time, Indians were appointed to the Viceroy's Executive Council. We're talking the absolute top decision-making body. Plus, out in the provincial councils, a non-official majority was finally allowed.
And again, this led to another massive personal milestone. A man named Satyendra Prasad Sinha was appointed as the law member. He completely shattered a major barrier. For the first time in history, an Indian was part of the highest executive body in British India. But
And here comes the really controversial part of this act. It also introduced the separate electorate. So let's be super clear on what this means. The act basically created a system of communal representation for Muslims. What it meant in practice was that Muslim members could only be elected by Muslim voters. That's it.
The historical impact of this one decision, really, it can't be overstated. By bringing in separate electorates, the act was seen by many as essentially legalizing communalism. And for his role in this, the Viceroy, Lord Minto, got a nickname that has stuck with him throughout history: the father of the communal electorate. So, after this whole 50-year journey, from that first tiny crack to a much wider opening, what's the lasting legacy here? What should we really take away from these three foundational acts? Let's just quickly recap this whole slowly opening door story. It all started back in 1861 with that first small step of bringing Indians into the lawmaking process. Then, in 1892, their role got bigger. They could actually debate the budget. And finally, 1909, a huge leap in representation, but one that also brought in that incredibly divisive idea of separate electorates.
And that really brings us to our final thought, the big question at the end of all this. There's no doubt that this 50-year period of reform brought Indians into the government in a way that had never happened before. It opened a path that was completely sealed shut. But you're left with this really challenging question. Was this a genuine path to a unified India? Or did the way they did it, especially with that last act, actually plant the seeds of future division? It's a tough one, and definitely something to think about.